Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling something a little different. We're diving into the world of archetypes.
Archetypes, yeah. Yeah,
And
that's right.
those recurring characters, those patterns, those symbols that we see showing up again and again and again.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Exactly.
All over the place.
Yeah, in myths and movies, and stories, and everywhere in between. And
Yeah.
our guide for this little deep dive is going to be, you guessed it,
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia, the ultimate source
Love it.
of all dubious information.
Right. Well, sometimes dubious.
Sometimes, yeah. We'll see how good it is today.
I think this one's going to be good.
I think so. Their article on archetypes is actually, I was pretty impressed. It goes pretty deep.
It does. It's a deep dive.
Yeah, so let's jump in. Let's not waste any time. So like right off the bat, they start talking about how archetypes are like these original blueprints, these prototypes.
Yeah, exactly. Like the original mold, right? Like the essential form of something that then gets copied and interpreted.
Okay.
Across different cultures, different time periods.
Yeah. So like, I don't know if you think about like the classic hero's journey.
Right.
Like we see that in a movie.
Oh, yeah.
We're essentially seeing just like a variation on that same archetype.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the crazy thing is those stories they still totally work, right? Even if they're like thousands of years old, they're tapping into something very deep and fundamental.
It's like our brains are just like wired to get it.
I think so.
Even if we don't know why.
Totally.
And this is where things get a little funky for me. The article talks about this guy, Carl Jung. He's a psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
And he had some pretty intense ideas about archetypes.
He did. He really took this concept. I mean, we think about archetypes in storytelling a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But he really took it and applied it to the human psyche.
Okay, so what was his what was his main thesis on this, on archetypes?
Well, he believed that they weren't just, literary devices. He thought they were actually psychological structures.
Really?
Yeah, embedded in our unconscious minds.
Get out of here.
Yeah, he called them primordial images.
Whoa.
Representing like fundamental human experiences and motivations. Yeah.
So you're saying like these characters, these stories, they're not just like external things, they're like reflections of something inside of us.
In a way, yeah. And he believed they actually influence our perceptions, our behaviors.
No way.
Yeah.
Come on.
Even our dreams.
Wow, that's wild.
Right. Yeah, and he identified, there are common archetypes. We see them all the time. The hero, the shadow, the wise old man.
Right.
And each of those carries, different characteristics, symbolic meanings, and so on.
So like, okay, let's pick a character. How about Darth Vader?
Okay.
Classic villain.
Sure.
Would Jung say that he's like a manifestation of this like shadow archetype that's present in all of us?
Exactly. Yeah, the shadow represents the darker, the hidden aspects of our personality, not necessarily evil.
Right.
But often embodying the parts of ourselves that we, repress or deny or don't want to look at.
So it's like when we see these classic villains in movies and stuff.
Yeah.
They're not just there to like scare us. It's like they're tapping into something very real.
Totally. Yeah. And that's what I think makes those archetypal stories so powerful, right?
Yeah.
Because they do resonate on such a deep level, often unconsciously.
Yeah. And this is making me think of like, I don't know if you've ever read this book. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell.
He's like a classic.
It's a classic.
Yeah. But his whole thing about the monomyth, the hero's journey.
Right.
Like that's like a perfect example, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Of how this like one archetype, this one like story structure shows up over and over and over.
Again and again and again in every culture.
Yeah. Like it doesn't matter if we're talking about like ancient Greek myths or we're talking about like, I don't know.
Superhero movies.
Yeah. Superhero movies.
Exactly.
It's like the same, like building blocks are there.
They're all there.
Yeah. You got your hero's call to adventure. You got the trials and tribulations, the transformation.
The transformation, absolutely. And what's so interesting about those stories, I think, is that they don't just reflect our individual journeys.
Okay.
But they also connect us to something much larger than ourselves, right? This kind of shared human experience.
It's like we're all living out like different versions of the same story.
Totally.
With these archetypes as our kind of guideposts.
In a way, yeah, totally.
And so, okay, bringing it back to this Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
It also talks about how these archetypes, it's not just in like literature and mythology.
Right.
Like they pop up in places you might not expect, like marketing and stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I'd love to like dig into that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've definitely seen that.
Oh, yeah.
But I've never really like thought about it that consciously.
Well, think about, you see a car commercial and it's like a lone driver, driving through a rugged mountain landscape.
Right.
They're not just selling you a car, they're selling you the sense of like, freedom, adventure, self-reliance. It's tapping into that hero archetype.
Yeah, wow, that's such a good example.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so true. And it's like by aligning their product with that archetype, they can create like a way more powerful connection.
Absolutely. And it's not just products either. You think about political campaigns.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Use all this archetypal imagery and language to connect with voters.
100%. It's like that whole like...
The outsider.
The outsider, yeah. The outsider who's here to like shake things up.
Or the experienced leader.
Right, exactly.
Who's going to see us through these uncertain times.
Yeah. It's all like playing on those same tropes.
It's all tapping into those deep-seated desires and fears and aspirations that we all have.
So we've got literature, mythology, psychology, market. Like, are there any other places that these archetypes are kind of like lurking in the shadows?
Well, it's interesting. The Wikipedia article actually traces this whole idea back.
Okay.
Like all the way back to ancient Greece.
Get out of here.
To Plato.
Plato, like the philosopher.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about this?
So he used a different term.
Okay.
He called them eidos.
Eidos.
Or like ideas.
Okay.
And he believed that these were like these pure, eternal forms that existed,
right,
beyond our senses in a different realm.
Okay, so how does that connect to like archetypes as we've been talking about them?
So for Plato, these eidos were like the blueprints for everything in the physical world.
Okay.
He believed that everything we see around us is just like an imperfect reflection of these perfect forms.
Okay.
So like there's an ideal form of a tree.
Okay. And
all the trees in the world are just like variations on that.
So he's basically saying there's like this underlying structure to reality.
Yeah.
And these eidos are like the key to understanding it.
Exactly. And, and while his approach was definitely more like philosophical and psychological, it still like points to this idea.
Yeah.
That there are these universal patterns, these forms that shape how we see the world.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground here.
But we have.
From ancient Greece to like modern day marketing. It's pretty wild.
It is wild. It's everywhere.
Yeah. It's everywhere. These archetypes are everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes them so endlessly fascinating, right?
Totally.
It's like they give us a glimpse into how our minds work.
Yeah, for sure.
Our cultures.
Yeah.
The stories we tell.
It's like this hidden language we're all speaking.
It really is, yeah.
So I guess like as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here on archetypes, what's like the one thing you hope our listener like takes away from this whole conversation?
I think the most important thing to remember is that archetypes, they're not just these abstract ideas.
Right.
They're not just literary devices or psychological concepts.
Yeah.
They're actually really powerful tools for understanding ourselves, understanding the world around us, understanding, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other.
Yeah. It's like once you see them, you can't unsee them.
Totally, yeah.
They're everywhere.
They're everywhere, yeah.
And maybe like by understanding them a little bit better, we can start to like, I don't know, connect with something a little deeper, a little more meaningful.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hey, that's our deep dive on archetypes.
Fun, right?
Hopefully you guys found it as mind-blowing and insightful as I did.
Wikipedia for the win.
Wikipedia, there you go. Sometimes they got some good stuff in there.
Sometimes.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
See you. Ever dreamed of a place where the sun just doesn't set for days?
Or a place where it dips below the horizon but then pops right back up.
Yeah, exactly. Like what even IS time in a place like that?
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
The Arctic Circle.
That area way up above 66 degrees, 34 minutes north latitude.
Known for the midnight sun and the polar night.
But it's way more than just like a line on a map, right?
Oh, definitely.
We've got a ton of great sources to really explore it.
Taking a look at the geography of people who actually live there.
Even figure out what Santa's address really means.
And what's so interesting about that line on the map is that it's always shifting.
Oh, really?
Because of the Earth's tilt, it drifts northward like 14.5 meters every single year.
Whoa. So the Arctic Circle I learned about in school,
Totally different now.
it's not the same anymore.
Yeah.
That's wild. I always thought of it as like this permanent thing.
Nope, it's dynamic, always moving.
So the Arctic Circle isn't just about like the midnight sun, is it? It's like a whole region.
A whole region, unique geography, even some big cities.
Cities?
Yeah, think about Murmansk, Russia.
Okay.
It's the biggest city north of the Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
Almost 300,000 people live there.
Wow.
It's a super important port, strategically important.
Yeah.
Because it's ice-free all year round thanks to the Gulf Stream.
Hold on, a huge city bigger than some countries' capitals inside the Arctic Circle?
Yep.
And it doesn't freeze over. I thought the whole region was just ice and snow.
That's a pretty common misunderstanding. The interior definitely gets super cold, like temperatures can plummet to -50°C in some places.
Oh.
But the coastal areas are actually pretty mild, especially those influenced by that Gulf Stream.
So like Norway, where those like incredible fjords are.
Exactly. Coastal Norway, even inside the Arctic Circle, has summer temperatures that can be like more southern places.
Wow.
It's this crazy mix. Temperate zones next to vast icy landscapes.
That's incredible. I'm starting to get how diverse this region is, but okay, I have to admit, when I think Arctic, the first thing I picture is the Northern Lights.
Oh, yeah?
Is that something you can see like everywhere in the Arctic Circle, or are there better spots?
Basically, the further north you go, the better your chances.
Okay.
Because the aurora borealis, the northern lights, happen when charged particles from the sun hit the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay.
And the magnetic field pulls them toward the poles.
Right.
So high latitude, long periods of darkness in winter, that's what the Arctic Circle has. So some of the best viewing spots on the planet.
I'm picturing it right now, standing under a dark sky with these like waves of color just dancing overhead. Definitely adding that to my bucket list.
Nice.
But it makes you wonder, what's it actually like to live there every day? Can you have like a normal schedule? Or does a midnight sun and polar night mess everything up?
That's a really good question. And the answer is that constant daylight in the summer and then the darkness in the winter, it definitely affects the people living there.
Yeah.
Their sleep, how they socialize, even their traditions, all shaped by this environment.
Makes you think about how our idea of a 24-hour day, that's just one way to experience time.
Totally. For people in the Arctic, it's cyclical, tied to those natural rhythms of light and dark. And it's not just about adapting physically. They've also developed rich traditions, ways of life that are like totally linked to this rhythm.
So it's like they're living in a completely different world.
In a way.
Speaking of different worlds, didn't Santa set up shop somewhere in the Arctic Circle? Is that like a myth, or can you actually visit Santa?
Well, the Arctic has always been a place of myths and legends.
Mm-hmm.
And one modern-day fairy tale is in Rovaniemi, Finland.
Okay.
The official hometown of Santa Claus. It's a few kilometers south of the Arctic Circle.
So not in it, but close enough, right?
Close enough. People come from all over to experience that Christmas magic all year long. You can visit Santa's village, send letters from the Santa Claus post office, even go on reindeer and husky sled rides.
That's so cool. It's amazing that place is real. So we've got busy port cities, surprisingly mild coasts, a deep freeze inland, the Northern Lights, and Santa Claus Village, all within this mysterious, constantly moving Arctic Circle. I see why they call it the land of the midnight sun. But who were the first people to live there, and how did they manage to, like, actually survive in such a tough place?
That's where it gets really interesting. The Arctic is home to lots of different indigenous peoples, each with their own traditions and ways of life. They've been thriving in this demanding environment for centuries.
Okay.
Take the Sami people, for example.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them. Aren't they the reindeer herders?
That's right. They're an indigenous Finno-Ugric people.
Okay.
They live in the Arctic area of Sapmi. That covers parts of northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and even a little bit of Russia.
Wait, so their territory crosses 4 countries?
Yep.
That's incredible. Tell me more about the reindeer herding, though. What does it actually involve?
It's more than just raising reindeer for food and clothes. For a lot of the Samis, especially those living inland, it's a way of life.
Okay.
It's semi-nomadic, deeply tied to their culture and their relationship with the land. They move with their herds throughout the year, following traditional migration routes passed down through generations.
So they're always on the move, following the reindeer as they look for food and better grazing. That must be so hard, especially in such a harsh environment.
It definitely is. But the Samis have developed incredible skills and knowledge over centuries. They depend on reindeer for almost everything: food, clothing, transportation, even tools.
Wow.
It's a truly symbiotic relationship built on deep respect and understanding.
It makes you think about how much we can learn from these indigenous cultures about resilience and living in balance with nature. But with all the climate change stuff happening, how is that impacting the Sami way of life?
That's the big question. Climate change is a huge challenge for the Sami and their traditions. The warmer temperatures are messing with migration patterns. The reindeer can't find good grazing as easily. The weather is unpredictable, which makes travel difficult and dangerous. And then the melting permafrost. That's changing the landscape they've called home for generations.
So it's not just about the reindeer, it's about their whole way of life being threatened.
Exactly.
That's just heartbreaking.
It really highlights the human cost of climate change, something we often forget about in the big picture.
We've covered a lot. The shifting boundaries of the Arctic Circle, the Sami people and their reindeer, even the potential impacts of climate change. The Arctic is clearly a beautiful, culturally rich place, ecologically important, but facing huge challenges.
You got it. And we're just scratching the surface. There's so many more fascinating stories out there, from incredible wildlife to the global politics of all this melting ice.
Well, I'm ready to dive deeper. Let's go. So we were talking about the Sami and how climate change is affecting their reindeer herding. It really shows how connected everything is up there in the Arctic.
Absolutely.
But the Salmonids are just one group, right? Who else lives in the Arctic Circle?
Oh, the Arctic is like a mosaic of cultures. You have the Inuit in North America, spread across Canada and Greenland, even Alaska.
Okay.
Their history and traditions are totally tied to those icy landscapes in the vast ocean.
Yeah.
They used to be nomadic, following marine mammals like seals and whales.
Wow.
They have this deep understanding of the ice, the weather, and navigation.
I can't even imagine navigating by the stars in a place where the sun barely sets or barely rises, depending on the season.
Right.
Their knowledge must be incredible.
Absolutely. Think about the skills you'd need to hunt on sea ice that's always moving, or build shelters that can survive Arctic storms.
Yeah.
And to know the signs of changing weather.
It's a testament to just how adaptable humans can be.
It really is.
But it's more than just survival skills, right?
Yeah.
Didn't they also develop some pretty intricate art?
Oh, for sure.
Like what?
Well, the Inuit are famous for their carvings, often of animals or scenes from their daily life. These aren't just pretty things. They're expressions of their culture, their connection to the land, and their understanding of the animals.
It's like each carving tells a story, passing down history and knowledge through generations.
That's a great way to put it.
But with all the changes in the Arctic, are these traditions at risk? We were talking about climate change affecting the Sami. Is it the same for the Inuit?
Sadly, yeah. Climate change threatens their culture just as much as it does their environment.
How so?
The hunting grounds are less predictable because of the changing ice. Animal migrations are shifting, so food is harder to find.
Right.
Even the landscape itself is thawing, changing their travel routes and impacting their whole way of life.
It's like a double threat then, losing the environment and the traditions that define them.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to listen to Arctic communities.
Yeah.
They're the ones on the front lines of climate change, experiencing it firsthand. And they have so much knowledge and insight to offer.
So it's not just about studying the Arctic, it's about learning from the people who live there and understand it best.
Exactly.
What I'm hearing is a theme of balance.
Balance.
Yeah, balancing the needs of the people, the environment, and I guess the economic interests too.
Oh, you mean like those new shipping routes opening up because of the melting ice?
Yeah, exactly.
It's definitely a complex situation.
Yeah.
The melting Arctic does create some economic opportunities, like quicker shipping between Asia and Europe.
Okay.
And access to resources that were stuck under the ice, like oil and gas.
So less travel time, cheaper costs, maybe even more jobs.
Right.
Those all sound good, but isn't there a huge risk too?
Of course.
Like extracting those resources could damage a region that's already vulnerable.
You're hitting on a really critical point. It's about balancing the economic benefits with the risks to the environment.
Right.
The key is to approach it all carefully. Prioritize sustainability and responsible development. It's not about short-term gains. It's about using resources without destroying the environment that provides them.
It sounds like walking a tightrope.
You could say that?
So much potential, but so much at stake.
That's the Arctic in a nutshell.
So who decides how to move forward with all this?
Well, the Arctic Council plays a big role.
Okay, the Arctic Council, tell me more about them.
It's an intergovernmental forum with the Arctic states and indigenous people.
Okay.
They work on things like sustainable development, environmental protection, and scientific research.
So it's a place for discussion and collaboration. So it's not like a free-for-all with countries just taking whatever they want. There's a system for managing this new frontier.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the Arctic is everyone's responsibility.
Right.
That decisions made there affect not just the region, but the whole planet.
It's like what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic.
You got it.
It affects everyone.
We are all connected.
It's a good reminder.
It is.
So with all these challenges, is there anything happening in the Arctic right now that gives you hope? Like a sign that we're heading in the right direction?
Oh, well, there are definitely some positive things happening.
Like what?
Renewable energy projects are getting bigger in the Arctic, offering cleaner alternatives to those fossil fuels. More money is going into research to understand and fight climate change.
Good.
And there's a movement to empower indigenous communities to recognize their rights and include their knowledge in the decision-making.
So it's not all doom and gloom?
No, not at all. The Arctic is at a crossroads, but there's a growing awareness of the challenges and a real desire to find solutions.
That's good to hear.
It is.
Okay, we've talked about the human side of the Arctic, the cultures, the challenges, and even some hope for the future.
It's a fascinating region.
It is. But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, something that's been calling to me since we started this whole deep dive.
What's that?
The Northern Lights.
Ah, the Aurora Borealis.
It's something that captures the imagination like nothing else.
I agree.
I can't even fathom what it must be like to see those curtains of light dancing across the sky.
It's pretty incredible.
So what causes it exactly?
Picture this.
Yeah.
Charged particles from the sun are flying through space, right?
Okay.
And then they slam into atoms in the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay.
That collision releases energy as light, creating those amazing colors.
So it's like a cosmic light show?
Exactly.
Is that why you see them more in the Arctic?
Well, the Earth's magnetic field pulls those particles toward the poles.
Okay.
So the Arctic Circle, high latitude, and those long, dark winters, it's like a front row seat for this spectacle.
So you're standing there under a dark sky, and suddenly these waves of green, blue, maybe even red and purple just wash over everything.
Yep, that's pretty much it.
Sounds otherworldly.
It's an experience you never forget, a reminder of how vast the universe is and how connected everything is.
Speaking of vastness, we've talked about the Arctic and its challenges, but let's zoom out for a minute.
Zoom out.
Yeah, how does the Arctic fit into global politics?
Well, the Arctic is becoming a bigger and bigger focus in international relations.
How so?
As the ice melts, new shipping routes open up and resources become available.
Right.
It leads to this complex mix of economic interests, national security worries, and environmental concerns.
So countries are competing for access and influence.
Yeah, there's potential for conflict, but also an opportunity to cooperate. Remember the Arctic Council. They're an example of how countries can work together to manage the challenges and opportunities peacefully and sustainably.
Okay, so it's not a total free-for-all. There's a sense that the Arctic is everyone's responsibility.
Exactly. What happens in the Arctic affects everyone, from sea level rise to weather patterns, even the health of the planet.
So it's another reminder that we're all connected.
We are.
Well, we've covered a lot today, from the Northern Lights to international relations.
We have.
But there's one place we haven't explored yet, a place with a special mystique.
Where's that?
The North Pole.
Ah, the North Pole, the very top of the world, the point where everything converges.
A place that has fascinated explorers and dreamers for centuries.
It has.
It feels almost mythical, like it exists on maps but is somehow out of reach.
There's definitely a sense of mystery surrounding it.
Yeah.
And unlike the South Pole, which sits on a continent, the North Pole is in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, on sea ice that's always moving.
Wait, so there's no solid ground at the North Pole, just ice?
That's right, constantly moving, making it a real challenge to reach.
Wow.
You can't just plant a flag and say, I'm here, because the ice is always shifting.
That makes it even more intriguing.
It does.
But can anything live there? In such extreme conditions?
It's definitely harsh.
Yeah.
You won't find polar bears. They stick to areas with seals.
Okay.
But you might see walruses.
Oh, cool.
And under the ice, there's a surprisingly diverse ecosystem of marine life.
Wait, there's life under the ice at the North Pole?
You bet.
What kind of creatures are we talking about?
Think tiny plankton, fish, even narwhals.
Narwhals? Like with the tusk?
The one and only.
At the North Pole. Now that's something I'd love to see.
It's proof that even in the most extreme places, life finds a way.
This is amazing. But I have another North Pole question.
Shoot.
I read somewhere that it's not a single point, but an area. Is that right?
That's a sharp observation.
Mm-hmm.
It depends how you define North Pole.
Okay.
There's the geographic North Pole, the point where the Earth's axis meets the surface.
Right.
But there's also the magnetic North Pole, where the Earth's magnetic field points straight down.
Hold on. So there are two different North Poles?
Think of it as two different ideas of north.
Okay.
The geographic one is fixed, but the magnetic one is always moving.
So even north isn't as simple as we think.
Exactly. The Earth's magnetic field is always changing, and so is the magnetic North Pole.
Wow.
It's been moving toward Siberia pretty quickly lately.
So the maps are literally changing.
Pretty much. It shows just how dynamic our planet is and how much we still have to learn.
My brain is officially full. We've gone from reindeer herding to the magnetic North Pole and everything in between.
It has been quite the journey.
It has, and we're not done yet. There's still so much more to explore. That magnetic North Pole thing really got me thinking.
Yeah.
It's always moving.
Yeah.
I always thought it was fixed, like the North Star.
A lot of people do.
But if it's always moving, how do we even know where it is?
Scientists track it carefully.
Okay.
They use satellites and observatories on the ground to keep an eye on the Earth's magnetic field.
Okay.
That way they can pinpoint the magnetic North Pole's location.
So it's not like our compasses are going to suddenly go haywire one day.
No, not that dramatic.
Okay.
It's gradual, but it definitely matters, especially for things like navigation and maps.
Makes sense. Something that seems, I don't know, abstract, like the magnetic North Pole,
Yeah.
actually has real-world consequences.
It does.
But let's get back to the actual North Pole for a second.
Okay.
We were talking about how it's this giant ice sheet that's always shifting. Does that mean it's impossible to visit?
Not impossible, but definitely a huge challenge.
Yeah.
You need special expeditions, the right equipment, people who know how to handle those extreme conditions, the moving ice, and unpredictable weather.
So not exactly a place you can just book a flight to.
Uh-huh.
But for those who do go there, it must be an incredible experience standing at the top of the world.
Surrounded by ice and sky, knowing that every direction is south.
Wow. I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
It's exhilarating and humbling all at once.
But with all this talk about the ice melting, is the North Pole even going to be there in the future?
It's a real concern.
Yeah.
As the Arctic gets warmer, the sea ice thins and shrinks.
Right.
The North Pole itself might not disappear completely,
Okay.
but it'll definitely be harder to reach, and the ice pack itself will change.
It's kind of sad. It's not just about the environment. It's about losing this place that's captured our imaginations for so long.
You're right. It's a loss we should all feel.
Yeah.
But maybe this feeling of loss can also make us act. Remind us that we need to protect this fragile region.
Not just for the Arctic itself, but for the whole planet.
Exactly.
That's a good way to look at it.
I think so.
The Arctic is sending us a message, telling us to pay attention, to take responsibility.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from it?
I hope they come away with a sense of awe and wonder, a deeper appreciation for the Arctic, its beauty, how complex it is, how important it is to our planet.
Yeah.
But I also hope they feel a sense of urgency, that the future of the Arctic is in our hands.
It's not just some far-off place, it's part of our home.
And it's worth fighting for.
Well said. This has been an amazing journey, exploring the Arctic Circle, from its shifting borders to the wildlife and resilient cultures that call it home.
And the challenges it faces.
We've learned about the Northern Lights, the magnetic North Pole. We even talked about the future of the North Pole itself.
We did.
But more than anything, I think we've gained a deeper understanding of how interconnected everything is.
That's the key.
And how important it is to protect this incredible region.
Absolutely. The Arctic reminds us that we're all connected, and that the choices we make today have consequences for everyone.
To our listeners, we leave you with this. The Arctic is calling. Will you answer? Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be talking about the legend of El Dorado. You've probably heard of it. You know, this mythical city of gold, supposedly hidden somewhere in South America. We're going to be using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on El Dorado to really explore it. You know, how did this legend start, and how did it captivate imaginations for centuries?
It really is remarkable how much of human history has been driven by the pursuit of wealth and just the allure of the unknown. I mean, El Dorado is the perfect example of that.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to the late 15th century. You know when Christopher Columbus lands in the Caribbean? He's like, oh my gosh, based on just the gold ornaments that he saw the natives wearing, he was convinced he'd found a gold mine, like a literal gold mine.
Yeah.
But this wasn't just like a random thought, right? This was heavily influenced by centuries of European legends and stories.
Exactly, yeah. Stories about the Isles of the Blessed, Atlantis, even biblical tales of King Solomon's mines. I mean, all of these fueled this sort of European fascination with finding a land just overflowing with gold.
Yeah, right. A land paved with gold, streets of gold.
Exactly.
And of course, the Caribbean, it didn't turn out to be the gold mine that they had envisioned. But instead of just giving up, right?
Yeah.
The Europeans just shifted their focus to the mainland, especially after, hearing about the conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas.
Yeah, and that early disappointment, in the Caribbean, it actually played a really crucial role, I think, in shaping the whole El Dorado myth because it redirected their attention, and it just fueled this desire to find an even richer, more elusive source of gold.
Right, like if that wasn't enough gold, there has to be more somewhere.
Right, exactly.
So this brings us to like those early whispers of El Dorado, right? And we start to see explorers like Ambrosius Dolfinger venturing into Lake Maracaibo, hearing these rumors from the natives about, these gold-rich tribes hidden in the Venezuelan mountains. And then there's, Nicholas Fetterman, who's, kind of tricked by the vast flooded grasslands of the Llanos, thinking he'd found a shortcut to the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
It seems like every explorer's getting in on this.
Yeah, and it really highlights how challenging it was, to just navigate this completely unfamiliar terrain and then, trying to decipher information from the indigenous populations, which, of course, had their own agendas and perspectives. And then even the landscape itself, could deceive them.
Yeah, for sure. And the risks were high, right? I mean, like Dolfinger, for example, he ended up being killed by a poisoned arrow while following a salt trail, like deep into the highlands. Like it just seemed like every failed expedition, every obstacle encountered, it just intensified the belief that El Dorado must be even more hidden, even more valuable.
Right. It's that classic case, of the unknown being more alluring than what we already know.
Totally.
And so the more elusive it seemed, the stronger that hold became on the European imagination.
So now the legend is starting to shift, right? From just this vague idea to something a little bit more concrete. And in 1534, Sebastian de Belalcazar, who was one of Pizarro's lieutenants, he captured a chief who spoke of a gold-rich land to the north. And this chief, they called him El Dorado, the Golden One.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how El Dorado started as a title, referring to an individual, not a place.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until later that the title became associated with this, mythical city.
Right. Yeah. The Golden One. It makes sense. So around the same time, that two separate expeditions that are happening, one led by Jorg Hoermuth von Speyer and another one by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. And both of them are searching for this mythical land called Meta.
And these simultaneous expeditions driven by, basically the same rumors, really highlights how contagious the whole idea of El Dorado had become. Everybody wanted to be the one to find it.
Yeah, like, I'm going to be rich.
Exactly, yeah.
And Quesada ended up making a pretty significant discovery, didn't he? He stumbled upon the Muisca civilization, a society that had skilled goldsmiths and really used gold extensively in their religious practices.
Yeah, and the discovery of the Muisca had a profound impact, I think, on the whole El Dorado legend. Because here you have, a real culture with a real connection to gold. And this just further solidified the belief, that a city of gold must exist somewhere nearby.
Like, oh, it must be true. We found these guys. They have gold. There must be tons of gold.
Exactly.
And the Muisca were a complex society, right? Ruled by leaders that were known as the Ziba and the Zak. And like you said, expert goldsmiths. But interestingly, they didn't actually have any gold mines within their territory.
Yeah. And that fact often gets overlooked in the whole El Dorado narrative. I mean, their wealth really came from trade and skilled craftsmanship, not from some, mythical gold mine.
But sadly, their skill and riches ultimately led to their downfall. Because Quesada, consumed by this thirst for gold, he conquered the Muisca, he looted their treasures, and he even accidentally burned down their sacred temple at Sogamoso.
Yeah, and the conquest of the Muisca is just a tragic reminder, of the dark side of exploration and just the destructive impact of colonial ambitions. And it really marks the beginning of this kind of feverish and ultimately futile search for a city that never truly existed.
Yeah. So we've got the stage set right. We have the desire for gold. We have the whispers of El Dorado. And now we have this conquest of a civilization that, seemed to confirm the existence of vast riches. So where do we go from here?
Well, the legend of El Dorado is about to take an even more dramatic turn. Because the conquistadors, convinced that an even greater prize awaited them, they begin to venture deeper into the uncharted territories of South America, fueled by even more elaborate accounts of a golden king and a hidden city.
So in 1539, the historian Oviedo, he writes about this golden chief, right? This guy who would cover himself in gold dust every day and wash it off in this sacred lake. So where did this story come from, and how did it become so central to the whole El Dorado myth?
Well, that's a great question, and one that has puzzled historians, for centuries. Some believe that the Spanish actually heard this tale from the Muisca themselves, while others argue that it was a fabrication, a story that was kind of concocted to justify this relentless pursuit of gold. But either way, this really vivid image of a king just shimmering with gold, it really captured the European imagination. And it just solidified the belief that El Dorado was a real physical city.
Yeah, it's such a vivid image, right? It makes sense that it would capture imaginations.
Totally.
So then in the 1580s, Juan de Castellanos, he specifically links this ritual to the Muisca. He describes a king making offerings from a raft.
And by connecting the ritual to a specific culture and location, Castellanos further kind of cemented the El Dorado legend in the minds of the Europeans.
Right.
Now, it wasn't just this vague story. It was tied to a people and a region that had already yielded significant wealth.
Right. So then we get even more specific. Pedro Simón, writing in the early 17th century, claims that this ceremony actually took place at Lake Guatavita near Bogota, and describes the gold dust as this offering to, this mystical being dwelling in the lake.
Yeah, and Simon's account adds another layer of mystique to the whole El Dorado myth. He introduces this idea of as a supernatural element, suggesting that the gold is not just this material possession, but something that's connected to a powerful, otherworldly force.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay, this is getting good. So then in 1636, we have Juan Rodriguez Freire, and he claims to have learned this from the nephew of the last indigenous ruler of Guatavita. And he suggests that it was actually an investiture ritual for each new Muisca ruler. So we have all these accounts, right? But how much of it is true?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And it continues to be debated among historians. We have the accounts of the Spanish chroniclers, but then we also have archaeological evidence, like the Muisca raft, which is this golden artifact depicting a chief on a raft surrounded by attendants. And it's tempting to see this as evidence of the ritual. But we have to be really careful, I think, about jumping to conclusions.
It's just so fascinating how the El Dorado legend has evolved over time, right? With each new account adding another layer of detail, another element of intrigue. It's this story that just seems to confirm itself with every telling.
Exactly, yeah. And the more the story was told, the more people were willing to risk everything to find this mythical city.
Yeah, so this brings us to the expeditions, right? And I'm not just talking about these small scouting missions. I'm talking about these massive undertakings involving hundreds of men, all driven by the belief that they could find the ultimate prize, which was El Dorado.
Right, and these expeditions weren't just about finding gold. They were also about expanding empires, claiming territory, and really asserting dominance over the native populations.
So let's start with Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the famous, Francisco Pizarro. He sets out from Quito in 1541, following these rumors of Cinnamon Valley and, civilization adorned in gold. And his journey takes him down the Coca and Napo rivers, deeper and deeper into the uncharted Amazon basin.
And Pizarro's expedition marks a significant shift, I think, in the search for El Dorado, because it moves away from that Muisca region and further into the unknown. Yeah. Really kind of expanding the scope of the quest and just adding to that mystique.
Right, like if it wasn't there, it has to be further out there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's on this expedition that Francisco de Orellana, who gets separated from Pizarro, he ends up leading the first European voyage down the entire Amazon River.
That's wild.
The whole thing.
Yeah, and Orellana's encounter with the Omagua people, who were perceived as wealthy and powerful, this just further fueled the El Dorado myth, His accounts, although they were likely exaggerated, they added another layer to this belief that a sophisticated and gold-rich civilization existed deep within the Amazon rainforest.
Right. So the Omagua, they were known for wearing gold ornaments. But their wealth is really more about their, mastery of the river and their trade networks than any mythical city of gold.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the European perception of wealth often differed from the indigenous understanding of value.
Yeah.
For the Omagua, their wealth was really rooted in their connection to the natural world, whereas for the Europeans, it was all about accumulating gold.
Yeah, yeah. Very different. So the search continues, right? Hernan de Quesada, who is the brother of the conquistador who conquered the Muisca, he heads south from Bogota, hoping to find the source of his brother's wealth.
Right. He was convinced that his brother wouldn't have just abandoned his territory without a compelling reason.
Yeah.
So he set out to find, what his brother may have left behind.
And then there's Philip von Hutten, right? This German explorer who is following the same trail as Quesada, equally convinced that El Dorado must be out there somewhere. But sadly, both expeditions end in failure and hardship.
Yeah, and these repeated failures, far from diminishing the legend, seem to just intensify it.
Right, like, okay, there must be something out there.
Right, exactly. The fact that nobody had found El Dorado simply strengthened the belief that it must be even more hidden, even more valuable.
Yeah, it's almost as if the failures themselves became part of the legend, adding to its allure and mystique.
Right. And that brings us to one of the most infamous expeditions in the whole El Dorado saga, which is Pedro de Ursua's expedition of 1560.
Tell me more.
All right. Well, this journey down the Amazon, it was as much about providing employment for restless veterans as it was about finding El Dorado. And it actually led to one of the most notorious figures in the whole El Dorado story, which is Lope de Aguirre.
Ah, Lope de Aguirre, yes.
Yeah.
I've heard whispers of his ruthlessness.
Yeah. He led a mutiny. He abandoned the quest for gold. And he even attempted to conquer Peru. So his story is really a chilling reminder, I think, of the greed and violence that often accompanied these expeditions.
Yeah. The quest for El Dorado could really bring out the best and the worst in people.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a very high-stakes game driven by ambition, desperation, and often, a complete disregard for the indigenous populations that they encountered.
So even after Ursua's failed expedition, the search continued.
Right. Martín de Poveda, he led a new expedition from Peru in 1566, focusing on the eastern llanos. And even Jiménez de Quesada, now the Adelantado of New Granada, he launched his own expedition into the eastern plains in 1569.
Yeah, it's remarkable how persistent, this El Dorado myth was. Even those who had explored the region extensively, couldn't shake the belief that this city of gold must be out there somewhere.
It's amazing, isn't it? We've gone from the Caribbean to the Andes to the heart of the Amazon, and the search just continues. And it's about to take us to new and even more challenging territory with a man named Antonio de Berrio.
Oh.
Yeah. This guy was obsessed with finding El Dorado. So Antonio de Berrio, he inherited more than just, Jiménez de Quesada's estate.
No.
He also inherited his obsession with El Dorado.
It's like a family curse or something.
Right.
The curse of El Dorado.
Oh, exactly.
De Berrio was convinced that El Dorado was hidden in the Guianas, which is like, a region east of the Orinoco River. It's almost like the search for this city of gold was becoming like a generational pursuit, like the torch had been passed.
Right. Well, he launched 3 major expeditions into the Guianas, each one fueled by rumors and driven by this unwavering belief that he was, on the verge of this monumental discovery.
So his first attempt in 1584, it took him to the banks of the Orinoco.
Yeah.
And he's hearing these stories from indigenous captives.
Right.
About, great settlements overflowing with gold and precious stones. And they even spoke of this vast lake called Manoa, adding yet another layer of mystery to the whole El Dorado legend.
Oh, yeah. Those accounts must have been incredibly enticing. Can you imagine just the effect those stories had on Berrio and his men? A lake so vast, it's practically an inland sea, surrounded by cities teeming with gold.
Yeah. Fueled by those stories, Berrio leads his men across the Orinoco. But, the harsh realities of the terrain, and maybe even his own, overconfidence, proved to be his undoing.
It's so easy to underestimate, the challenges of exploring this kind of environment. The dense jungles, the unpredictable rivers, the threat of disease. I mean, these expeditions really push men to their absolute limits.
But Berrio was undeterred, right? So he launches the second expedition in 1587, determined to find a way into those mountains where he believes El Dorado is hidden.
It seems like each setback just strengthened his resolve. Like he was absolutely convinced that he was on the right track.
But this time, he faced a different kind of challenge, didn't he? His own men. Exhausted, disillusioned, They rebel and desert, leaving Berrios stranded, forced to retreat.
It's a good reminder that these expeditions weren't just about overcoming geographical obstacles.
Right.
They also required a very strong leader, someone who could maintain morale and keep the group focused on the ultimate goal.
Right, yeah. A leader who could maybe inspire them to stay.
Right.
Keep going. So Berrios' third expedition in 1590 was maybe his most audacious. He decides to navigate the Orinoco River itself, hoping to reach the Caroni River, which flowed from the Guianas, and he was convinced that this was the key to unlocking the secrets of El Dorado.
Right. Well, the Caroni River was known to be incredibly difficult to navigate. I mean, even impassable in some sections. So it was a very risky gamble. But for Berrio, the potential reward, it definitely outweighed the dangers.
So he does eventually reach the Caroni, but he didn't have enough manpower to ascend it. But instead of giving up, he continues down the Orinoco, eventually reaching the Atlantic Ocean near Trinidad.
It's remarkable that he didn't turn back. I mean, most explorers probably would have given up at that point, but Berrios' determination, it seems almost superhuman.
So he establishes this new town, San Jose de Urruña, and began preparing for one final attempt to reach El Dorado. This was a man who dedicated his life to the pursuit of this mythical city.
It's a fascinating study, Berrios' story, in obsession. It raises all these questions about the nature of belief and just the lengths to which humans will go to achieve their goals.
Right. It's almost tragic, He spent years, decades, even chasing this dream that ultimately eluded him.
Yeah.
But while Berrios' quest may have ended in Trinidad, the legend of El Dorado was about to be picked up by another very ambitious explorer, Sir Walter Raleigh.
Right. The arrival of Raleigh in 1595 marks a new chapter, really, in the whole El Dorado saga. The legend had crossed borders, captivating the imagination of a whole new generation of explorers.
Right. So Raleigh captured Berrio, and fascinated by his stories of a golden city and this vast lake, he set out on his own expedition up the Orinoco River. He even met with a native chief named Topiawari, who told him about this gold-rich tribe that had possibly invaded Guyana from the west.
So this new information, potentially linking El Dorado to the Incas, I mean, that must have been incredibly intriguing to Raleigh, because the Incas were known for their wealth, and their advanced civilization.
Yeah.
So the idea that they might have established this hidden outpost in the Guianas would have added another layer of plausibility to the El Dorado myth.
Right. So Raleigh, armed with this new information and, of course, driven by his own ambitions, he pressed onward. And he eventually reaches the mouth of the Caroni River. But just like Berrio before him, he's unable to ascend the river.
The Caroni River really seemed to be this insurmountable obstacle for both explorers.
Yeah.
It's as if the legend of El Dorado itself was, guarding its secrets, making it nearly impossible to reach the heart of its mythical domain.
Right, like, you shall not pass.
Right.
The river's like, nope.
Yeah.
So despite the setback, Raleigh sends out scouting parties, and he even ventures out himself. But they returned with only a few worthless stones and more rumors of a gold-rich lake at the head of the Caroni.
It's interesting how these rumors just persisted even in the face of repeated failures. It seems that for many explorers, the belief in El Dorado was so strong that it outweighed any evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, they wanted to believe so bad they needed to.
Exactly.
So Raleigh's expedition was ultimately unsuccessful. But his lieutenant, Lawrence Kemmys, brought back stories of a vast lake called Parim, which he believed to be the legendary Manoa. And this mythical lake, said to be so large it was indistinguishable from the sea.
Wow.
It appeared on maps for over a century, even though no European had ever laid eyes on it.
Wow. The legend of Lake Parim almost became as powerful, as the legend of El Dorado itself. It represented this ultimate prize, like this hidden paradise teeming with wealth and wonder. I mean, it's a real testament to the enduring power of a good story.
Yeah.
Even in the absence of any concrete proof.
Right, so the search for Lake Parim continued for generations, with explorers like Jean Grillet and Francois Bechamel venturing into the Guianas, hoping to find this elusive body of water.
Right, and then in 1740, Nicholas Horseman, he discovered a small lake called Amuku, which some believed to be Lake Parim, but it was far too small and insignificant to be the legendary lake that Kemmys describes.
Yeah, like, that's it. That's all we get.
Right.
This little puddle.
Exactly.
It wasn't until 1800 that the myth of Lake Parim was finally debunked.
Really?
Alexander von Humboldt, who is this, renowned explorer and scientist, he conducts this thorough survey of the region, And he concludes that Parim was simply a local term for any large body of water.
Oh.
And he believed that the seasonal flooding of the plains was probably the source of the legend.
Ah, okay. So Humboldt's findings really mark a turning point, I think, in the El Dorado saga. Because his scientific approach, based on observation and analysis, really challenged this centuries-old belief in a literal city of gold.
So, okay, the idea of El Dorado as like this geographical location was fading. But what about its legacy? How did this myth continue to influence culture and art and, the human imagination?
Well, that's what's so fascinating about these enduring myths, Even after they're debunked, they retain a certain power, a resonance that transcends their original context.
It seems that even when you're faced with, scientific evidence, the allure of the unknown can be hard to resist.
Yeah.
So the legend of El Dorado may have lost its geographical grounding, but its symbolic power, that continued to resonate, right?
Right. It's as if El Dorado transformed from a physical place to a state of mind, representing a kind of utopia, a place where, wealth and happiness could be found.
Right. And we see this reflected in literature. For example, Voltaire's Candide. El Dorado is portrayed as this utopian society. But even in this paradise, Candide finds that true happiness, it remains elusive.
Right. Voltaire was really using El Dorado to critique the idea that wealth and material possessions alone can lead to fulfillment. It's a reminder that even in a land of abundance, human nature remains complex. And the search for meaning, it goes beyond material riches.
Right, yeah. So then there's Edgar Allan Poe's poem El Dorado, which takes a more, symbolic approach, I guess. And the knight's relentless quest for this golden city, it becomes a metaphor for the search for truth, for an ideal that may ultimately be unattainable.
Right. Poe's poem speaks to that, that human longing for something more, something beyond the limitations of our, everyday existence. So El Dorado, in this context, it becomes a symbol of our aspirations, our dreams, our desire to find something truly meaningful in life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating how this legend, born from a mixture of, indigenous accounts, European desires, and a whole lot of misinterpretation, has managed to transcend its historical origins and become like this timeless symbol.
Right. And it's not just confined to literature. El Dorado continues to appear in popular culture, from movies like, The Road to El Dorado and Aguirre, The Wrath of God, to video games like Uncharted, Drake's Fortune. It's a real testament to the enduring power of this myth to capture the imagination.
Yeah, it's almost as if each generation rediscovers El Dorado, reinterpreting the legend through the lens of their own time and culture. So for some, it represents adventure and the thrill of exploration. And for others, it embodies the pursuit of wealth and the allure of the unknown.
Right. El Dorado has become this kind of blank canvas onto which we project our own desires and aspirations. It's a reminder that even in a world increasingly dominated by technology and information, the human spirit still yearns for mystery, for wonder, for the possibility of something extraordinary.
So what does this all mean for us today? What can we learn from the legend of El Dorado? I mean, on the surface, it's a tale of ambition, greed, and the relentless pursuit of wealth, often at the expense of others.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession and the importance of questioning our motivations. The conquistadors who risked everything to find El Dorado, they often lost sight of their humanity, driven by this thirst for gold that just consumed them.
But it's also a story about the power of belief, the lure of adventure, and that human desire to explore the unknown. It reminds us that we are capable of great feats of courage and perseverance, even when we're faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges.
Right. El Dorado challenges us to examine our own relationship with wealth, success, and the pursuit of happiness. It asks us to consider what truly matters in life and to be mindful of the potential consequences of our actions.
So here's a question for you to ponder. How do modern-day El Dorados, be they technological advancements, financial markets, or even personal goals, how do those shape our own desires and actions? Are we still searching for that elusive city of gold, that ultimate source of happiness and fulfillment?
It's a question worth reflecting on. What are the El Dorados in your own life? And what lengths are you willing to go to achieve them?
That's something to think about. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the legend of El Dorado. It's a story that continues to fascinate and inspire, reminding us of the enduring power of myths and that enduring human quest for meaning and adventure.
Yeah, we hope this journey has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to explore the hidden depths of history and the enduring power of stories.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for your own El Dorado.